Welcome to the Roy Morgan Weekly Update. As we settle back into work and the summer holidays begin to wind down, we come to this annual question relating to Australia Day, which has grown in prominence in recent years. And we have some interesting results from a special Roy Morgan SMS poll this week on how Australians view Australia Day. There's also big news from across the Tasman, with Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern resigning and being replaced by Chris Hipkins. We have the data from the latest Roy Morgan New Zealand poll, which shows why Ardern probably felt this was a good time to move on from the top job. But first, a look at the key weekly indicators. Support for the Albanese government is virtually unchanged this week, with a lead of almost 20 points. The ALP is on 59% compared to the Coalition on 41% on a two-party preferred basis. Government confidence is also virtually unchanged this week at 107, with 44.5% of Australians saying the country's heading in the right direction and 37.5% saying the country's heading in the wrong direction. Consumer confidence, on the other hand, is still low. After 2 weeks of increases, consumer confidence has retracted slightly this week, down 1.8 points to 85.9, well below that magic 100, and is a large 14.2 points lower than the same time a year ago. Next is inflation expectations, which have increased for the second straight week, up 0.3 percentage points to 5.7%. This means Australians are expecting 5.7% annual increases in inflation over the next couple of years. Despite these consecutive weekly increases, inflation expectations are still below their final reading of 2022. They were at 5.9% in mid-December. The big question on the inflation front, of course, is what will the official inflation rate be? The ABS CPI, or Consumer Price Index, figures for the December quarter will be released tomorrow. The Reserve Bank has forecast an annual figure of 8% for the calendar year 2022, but private economists, including the ANZ Bank, are forecasting an inflation figure of 7.8%. Importantly, the Roy Morgan Weekly inflation expectations, what consumers think, have remained well below the latest CPI or the ABS CPI figures in recent months, indicating consumers are not expecting the official numbers to keep increasing during the next 2 years. And now, turning to probably the most topical issue of the week, how Australians feel about our national holiday, Australia Day. The issue has taken on added importance this year with the Albanese government's stated commitment to a referendum on the voice to Parliament, set to be held later this year. There are even protest marches organised for Australia Day this year against the proposed referendum question by Indigenous activists who say there should be a treaty before there's a voice to Parliament. The latest Morgan poll shows 53% of Australians, the majority, in favour of the voice, 30% against, and 17% still undecided. It's a complicated and really contentious issue. In terms of the issue of Australia Day, for the last 3 years, Roy Morgan has surveyed Australians on the issue by asking the following question. On January 26, 1788, Captain Arthur Phillip landed at Sydney Cove. In your opinion, should January 26 be known as Australia Day or Invasion Day? The results over the last 2 years have been fairly consistent, and this remains the case this year. Nearly 2/3 of Australians, 64% this year, say January 26 should be known as Australia Day, and this is virtually unchanged from last year, when 65% gave that answer. But just over 1/3 of Australians, 36%, say the day should be known as Invasion Day. The real interest in this question comes from diving into the results by different demographics. So men are far more likely to be in favour of Australia Day than women. Over 2/3 of men, 69%, say the day should be known as Australia Day, compared to under 3/5 of women, 58%. These results are also pretty much unchanged from a year ago. The starkest and probably the most important divide on this question is age. A majority of Australians aged under 35 favour calling January 26 Invasion Day, whereas for those older than 35, they favour Australia Day. a majority of 56% of those aged 18 to 24 say January 26 should be known as Invasion Day. In comparison, a supermajority of 81% of people aged 65 and over say January 26 should be known as Australia Day. It's worth remembering when considering this issue that Australia Day has only been celebrated nationwide on January 26 for less than 30 years. As recently as 1994, the Australia Day public holiday was taken on Monday, January the 31st, the first Monday after January 26. Turning now to the international stage, New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern decided she no longer had, as she said, enough in the tank for another 4 years in the job. Ardern's resignation has been handled smoothly, with Police Minister and former Health and COVID-19 Response Minister Chris Hipkins taking over as New Zealand's 41st Prime Minister this week. And although Ardern's resignation has come as a shock to many, the recent Morgan polling results in New Zealand underline why her decision should perhaps not be such a shock. At the 2020 New Zealand election, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern led the Labor Party to a majority of the vote, the first time a party has achieved this since mixed member proportional voting was introduced in New Zealand in 1996. However, since 2020, since that election, support for Labor has crashed by over 20 percentage points and was only at 27.5% in December 2022, just before Christmas. The decline accelerated after September 2021, when Labor's support was at 45.5%, nearly double the support of the National that month. National were only 23%. National changed leader at the end of November 2021, and he's been ahead of Labor in every Roy Morgan New Zealand poll since January 2022. The latest poll taken before the resignation shows support for the National and likely coalition partners ACT and Z is now at 49.5%, compared to only 38.5% for the governing Labor and Greens coalition. This is a huge change since the 2020 New Zealand election, when Labor and the Greens won 57.9% of the vote, almost 25 percentage points ahead of the combined National and ACT and Z on only 33.2%. That's a 35 percentage point change in favour of National and ACT New Zealand in just over 2 years. The decline in support for Labor over the last 12 to 18 months has also been matched by huge drops in both government confidence and consumer confidence. Both these indicators are now at record lows, and these indicators tend to go together. The latest ANZ Roy Morgan Consumer Confidence Rating in New Zealand hit a record low of only 73.8 in December 2022, over 40 points below the pandemic high of 115.4 in April 2021. Roy Morgan government confidence has fallen even further, from a record high of 163 government confidence in April 2020, early in the pandemic, as Ardern's handling of COVID-19 was praised worldwide. The indicator government confidence has now fallen by well over 80 points to a record low of only 75. In December 2022, an increasing majority, 57% of New Zealanders, said the country's going in the wrong direction. Only 32% said the country's going in the right direction. So as New Zealanders deal with the highest inflation in over 30 years, rapidly rising interest rates, support for the Labor-led government of Jacinda Ardern has crashed. And given this context, it's perhaps understandable Ardern decided now was a good time to move on, having provided valuable leadership over a very challenging period. New Zealanders are set to go to an election later this year in October and will now face a choice between new Prime Minister Chris Hipkins and opposition leader Christopher Luxon. And that's a wrap for this very interesting week of data. Subscribe for free to our Roy Morgan YouTube channel for all the latest political, economic and market research data and insights. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to joining you next week with the latest data on consumer confidence, inflation expectations and voting intentions. Take care. See you next week.